Hello and welcome to another episode of the Graham Sibbald Podcast. My name's Jorja and I'll be your host today. As always, on the Graham Sibbald Podcast, we try to talk about a variety of things that are going on in the property sector. And today we're going to be talking to another member of the GNS team about student housing. In particular, we're going to be looking at marketing and the outlook on the sector going forward within Graham Sibbald. So sit back, relax and enjoy this week's episodes of the Graham Sibbald Podcast. Welcome to the Graham Sibbald Podcast. We are here today with Peter Fleming, who is a commercial investment agent and associate at Graham Sibbald, based within the firm's Edinburgh office. Afternoon, Peter. How are you today?
Yeah, not too bad. Thanks very much. Surviving the January.
Yeah, the joys, isn't it, at the moment? So could you tell us a little bit about your role within Graham Sibbald?
Yeah, no problem. I'm, as you mentioned, associate within the Edinburgh office and specifically the capital markets team, which a large part of that is out there kind of looking to source and advise on investment property acquisitions, but with, for me personally, a kind of specific focus on the kind of student and purpose-built student accommodation sector. So, I mean, I've been involved in student accommodation now probably for 7 years. And probably over that time, I've probably seen quite a marked difference in the student sector as it's kind of evolved from what has always been seen as a bit of an alternative sector into now a kind of mainstream investment category for both developers, operators, and investors.
So obviously you mentioned there about student housing. So I think maybe a good thing for you to explain is what is the size of the purpose-built student accommodation sector and where is it concentrated and how has it grown and evolved over the last decade?
Yeah, so probably to put the student accommodation sector in context, it's probably worth bearing in mind universities. There's specifically within the UK, there are 1.84 million students, of which there's about 460,000 are internationals coming from the kind of all corners of the globe. Now, within that, those students do have to live in accommodation, be it kind of private rented sector or purpose-built student accommodation. So you're probably looking at around 660,000 students live in purpose-built student accommodation, which is provided to them, and that's a range of, as things stand, the universities will operate or own about 50% of those beds. The rest are operated and owned by a myriad of investors, investor operators, private individuals, and institutional bodies. From an investment perspective, the sector's probably over the last 10 years, you're probably seen about 3.8 billion invested in the sector every year, and again that is from a range of different investors and operators. This year, or for 2020, we probably saw about 6 billion invested in the sector. Of that, what I would say is that's probably heavily weighted towards 5 billion of that was Blackstone's purchase of the IQ kind of portfolio and trading platform. But for other years, 2019, we saw 5.5 billion invested. 2018, we saw 3.7 billion invested. And probably, again, to put that in context, the UK kind of property investment over the last 10 years has probably averaged about 55 billion. So you're probably looking at, as things stand today, I think student or purpose-built student accommodation probably accounts for just shy of kind of 10% of the of the sector. Now, where's this concentrated? Similarly, where you see a lot of investment throughout the UK is in the main cities. That's probably true of student accommodation as well, where London, Manchester, Bristol, Birmingham, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, we've all seen kind of there's obviously student accommodation in there, but probably the key difference is a lot of the investment follows where the universities or established universities are. So probably slightly different areas that have high levels of investment and accommodation in those cities and towns such as kind of Oxford, Bath, St Andrews, Southampton, Durham, which perhaps aren't necessarily on your average kind of investors outlook, but from a student perspective, these are obviously quite popular areas where, especially, well-established university towns who have like a Russell Group Institute located in that city or town will be a kind of key area for investors when they make the decision of where to invest and why they're investing there. Is one, the kind of this how established that university is, how long they've been there, and how they rate, i.e. how popular they are with students. So someone like a St Andrews, where you think quite a small town in Scotland, but actually is a big university and a well-established university, is seen as one of the kind of best in the UK, will obviously could be popular for some investors.
Yeah, I mean, I went to the University of Edinburgh in 2015, and in Edinburgh alone, the amount of student housing now that I think has developed has really grown.
Yeah, no, there's been, over the last 10 years, we've probably seen a pretty significant jump in student numbers. I mean, I think overall there's probably been a 10% growth over the last 10 years. Probably the biggest driver that we've seen that's a kind of big difference is international students. I think I mentioned earlier there was about 460,000 international students in the UK. That's probably doubled over the last 10 years. And moving forward, I'll pick up on it later, but coming forward, we see that doubling again over the next 10 years. So, a key part of that is obviously, I think traditionally we see a lot of UK students perhaps go into kind of HMOs or kind of private rented sector, whereas I think the international market, one, they're coming across and they're paying for a premium education, and they perhaps want a premium accommodation to go with that. So that's probably driven quite a lot of the development in terms of a kind of flight to quality. So more developers are developing out kind of, I guess, higher spec buildings, studio space, close proximity to the universities, and that's probably what I've seen over the last few years in terms of how things have changed over the last decade.
I mean, definitely, I've seen some of the halls in comparison to what the mines were like. I was at uni, and I tell you, I'd like to go back to uni now and go into the halls. They're so much nicer now.
So I was just going to say, it's it's the big thing that we're seeing is now, since 2012 when they brought in, the student universities have been funded in a different way. The internationals are coming across and they're probably paying an average of about £27,500 in tuition fees. So you think, God, if they're coming over and paying that, they don't want to sit in a kind of a damp tenement on the outskirts.
Well, that's fair.
Town. So that's, they want a kind of premium or they want the kind of a quality of accommodation that fits their kind of quality of education.
Sure, yeah. So in terms of investing, who would you say is investing, and what have the levels of investment been like over the last couple of years?
Yeah, in terms of level of investment, I guess the big one 10 years ago, it was kind of, and I hate putting it in a kind of bracket, but it was seen as the alternative sector. Historically, we've seen industrial, retail, office, and leisure as the kind of four or the main kind of pillars of investment in UK. But I think in recent years, probably 10 years ago, it was mainly kind of slightly different kind of international private equity firms. Probably over the last few years, we've probably seen more and more UK institutional investors doing it. So your Aberdeen Standards, your Barings, your kind of Savills investment managers have all invested in student accommodation in the last 6 months, whereas 10 years ago you would have seen it would have been perhaps more like GIC, or a Singaporean-based company, Blackstone, continue to invest in the UK, and kind of Brookfield and Singapore Press Holdings as well are all companies that have invested kind of pretty big sums in that. I think the biggest year that was ever invested, well, I think I mentioned it, IQ, that was Blackstone for $5 billion, but I think the most ever invested in the sector has probably been about $8 billion in any kind of calendar year, but again, that was probably about 3 years ago.
Wow. And what do you think are the key drivers within the sector?
Probably the key key drivers. I think for investors, certainly, look, PBSA has always provided a kind of total, well, in the last 12 months, its year-on-year return was kind of 4.9%, which, when you actually get under the skin of it and have a look at it, when you compare it to other asset classes, it usually outperforms most of them. I mean, I think that 4.9%, if you can compare that with the kind of all property average of kind of minus 3.5% over the last year, I know COVID's had a big part to play in that. It just shows you, look, the sector is pretty resilient. It's quite established, and it's offering you good kind of returns on your investment. I think I'd maybe highlight that capital values have probably fallen by 0.5% in the last 12 months. But if you actually kind of offset with that, even throughout the kind of pandemic, we've seen kind of rents increased by about 1.6% kind of gross and 1.1% at on a net basis. It does show you have good returns for what you're kind of looking to where you're looking to invest. So it's still it is now a more established asset class, so it's easier for people to get their heads around what they're investing. But it is established, and despite the kind of pandemic issues, it's been it's continued to perform pretty well. I think now probably more than ever there's a greater focus on trying to make PBSA looking at the kind of occupational side of things. I think a key driver for developers has been when they look at the accommodation. In the past, it was accommodation. It was somewhere to live. But I think now they're trying to kind of develop homes for students. It's not just a kind of somewhere to crash for a couple of weeks or for a few months in between going back to your home. But I think that's a key thing. We're trying to, developers are keen to engage more with students to provide them with, not just somewhere to stay, but actually somewhere that you would call your home. I think that will come with time.
Yeah, well, especially as a lot of students have been trapped in their accommodation in the last few semesters, it's probably a good idea. So obviously I know you're based in Edinburgh, but in terms of the international market, are you seeing any current trends?
In terms of the international market, I mean, I think in terms of international students, I think people thought that potentially this could have been an issue, COVID could have been an issue in terms of them not coming back. But I think you'll find that demand was higher than ever. I think UCAS have just published their numbers, and applications were up this year. They've placed just over 114,000 students or new students into accommodation this year, or into university this year. The challenge is trying to get internationals over. So they've taken their place at university, but it's getting them coming over. But I think from an international perspective, I mean, we still see kind of large numbers of students wanting to come over. So I think I said that there's now 460,000 international students coming into the UK. The government have set as a bit of a, and they hate using the word target, but by 2030 they want an additional 300,000 students, international students, to come into the UK. So I think as a kind of sector, or as an area for focus, it will continue to, the international market will continue to come. And students, people have said, how's the UK been viewed by abroad? But I think there's probably more tensions. We have kept our borders open over the last few months, and I don't know if that's going to continue. But I think Australia, for example, there's a big Chinese market that moved to Australia for university every year. That's been closed, so they haven't got access into that market at the moment. So again, perhaps more Chinese students have looked to move to the UK as a backup because of that. But I think we do see that market will continue to kind of move quite well. The impact that will have for developers is, the type of product that they're looking to develop for students will change. I guess as a bit of a generalisation, you would have said your average kind of UK student, as I said, will go into the kind of private rented sector. They'll club in with a few mates and go into an HMO, tenement flat, wherever they can find it. Whereas the international is perhaps, wanting a better product and a better experience where, the accommodation is properly managed. There's security. There is a strong preference that it feels safer to be in that in a PBSA block rather than just an own block where you can't secure that yourself, or it's down to you to secure it. Whereas now there's roving patrols, there's a commissioner on it throughout the day to kind of look after the accommodation for students. So developers are going to have to try and kind of I guess not adapt, but just continue to evolve with that. Continue to offer accommodation that suits the international market.
Yeah, it is very interesting how things are changing. And you spoke a little bit there about some of the effects of COVID-19 on students coming over and such. Is there any other ways that the sector has been impacted by COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it all started, and we saw, especially in March, when we had our first lockdown, March 2020, when our first lockdown, we saw a number of students kind of going home. And the first question was, are they going to come back? International markets, will they be allowed into the UK? Will they come back? Will universities move to online learning? And although definitely universities have kind of pivoted towards a kind of online course, but I mean that is very much seen as, look, it's a short-term fix, but longer term we want students back on campus, and the campus is very much seen as the kind of the heart of the university, so that will continue. There were, so although I think digital learning will continue to be a part of the university experience, but as it will just be part of the experience. And so I guess kind of looking at the kind of numbers for this year, it's clear that, actually applications into university were up. So I think this year, 37% of all 18-year-olds in the UK applied to university and wanted to take a place at university. That's a kind of record high. Previously it was kind of around 34-35%. So it just shows you, as universities are as popular as ever. The issue has been the logistics of trying to get students back into. So I think if you spoke to all the university, the places were all taken, be it by UK students or international students. It was probably more the accommodation. There's been a bit of an issue where I think you're probably looking at across the board, take up of accommodation has probably been down 14%. And that's just because people have taken university courses and maybe decided to try and stay at home. And until the picture's clearer, they won't book accommodation. And also, when we saw students went back in October, we probably only saw about 85% of those students went back. So some of them, although they booked accommodation, they've maybe stayed at home until the picture's a bit clearer. A big part of that has actually been of the 15% that haven't checked into university yet. 85% of them were internationals, and a part of that has been just the logistics of getting them over, availability of flights, and just the unknown. There's one thing, a student perhaps from Glasgow going to Aberdeen, there's perhaps a bigger question mark around a kind of Indian or Chinese student coming across the UK, but ultimately they are all saying they want to come back. And although I think it's very much seen as this is a short-term issue, it's not to be downplayed, but I think the longer term kind of viability of the sector is still there. And the whole point that actually, although accommodation numbers are down, student applications for places have never been higher. It shows you, look, it's a pretty robust and established sector it's not going anywhere, and it should weather the storm.
Yeah, I think there'll always be that pull for people going to university. It's by the experience of leaving home and, going into halls and doing all the exciting things. So I think that probably adds to what you're saying. But what are your expectations, just to round up, for the future and growth within the sector?
The future, I mean, I think more than ever we need to be engaged with the students in the sector. So I think as a developer and investor is understanding the students, and I know there's been a big play of how we kind of operate student accommodation and just the kind of the mental health awareness around it as well, in terms of I think we've never really, we haven't given enough thought in the past perhaps to it's a big move for an 18-year-old, first time out of home, coming into accommodation. Perhaps a lot of them are on their own. It's just making sure that the accommodation that's developed for them, it's seen as a home. It's not just a kind of soulless, lifeless place for you to kind of sit for a few months or years whilst you're at university, and more of an engagement with students. I think that's a kind of key area for me. I think as well, just making sure that we understand that university is more than just an education. It's a large part of that person's rite of passage. Moving away from home, as I said, kind of living independently, making friends, and it's making sure that the student accommodation can help to kind of facilitate and provide for that. I think moving forward, I still see, as a pretty resilient sector. Its returns kind of outstrip kind of more traditional sectors like retail, which is obviously coming at a kind of challenging time just now, or other kind of key investment sectors. So I still think there'll be, strong institutional demand for good quality PBSA investment stock. So likewise, developers should continue to kind of look to identify opportunities to provide for them.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, for coming to speak to us about student housing today.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Peter, for your time today and for telling us all about student housing. I think we can all say we've learned some very interesting statistics along the way. If you would like to find out more or have any more questions, you can go to w.g-s.co.uk. You can also go to our YouTube channel and check out all the other podcasts that we have done so far. Thank you very much for joining us today, and stay safe.